Hey there. Tonight we are following one of the strangest old questions ever pressed into clay. A metal that gleams like trapped sunlight appears again and again in the oldest sacred rooms of human history. And somewhere between the temple storehouse, the royal tomb, the mine shaft, and the dark sky above Mesopotamia, a story began to grow that has never really gone to sleep. It says the first great gods of Sumer did not simply love gold because it was beautiful. It says they needed it. It says they came with a purpose, that they shaped human life under that purpose, and that the oldest whispers about our beginning may be tangled up with a hunger buried in the earth itself. If you enjoy stories like this, leave a like, subscribe, and stay here with me for a while, because this one starts in deep prehistory, moves through broken tablets and furious arguments, and ends with a question that still glows in the dark. Settle in. Let the room become a little quieter. That is enough. We do not need much more than the fire, the night, and this old, uneasy idea. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the world long before cities. The air is colder. Vast ice sheets still grip huge parts of the north. The land that will one day cradle the first written civilization has not yet learned the shapes of ziggurats or brick walls or processional roads. There are no kings in carved stone, no accountants muttering over grain, no priests lifting gold bowls toward the temple lamps. Only water, mud, wind, animal tracks, and small human groups moving through a dangerous earth with little more than bone memory and sharpened stone. It is a lonely image, and that loneliness is where the story likes to begin. Because a lonely world makes room for visitors. A silent plain lets the imagination hear footsteps that history itself cannot verify. Some stories need the comfort of an empty beginning. Others need that beginning to be interrupted. I have always found it interesting that the most persistent theories about human origins are rarely the ones that make us feel smaller. They are the ones that give us a role, a script, a function. We are not just here, they say. We were wanted, used, guided, built toward a task, even if the task itself was brutal. In the old theory we are following tonight, that task was gold. Not silver, not wheat, not cedar, not copper. Gold. It is a beautiful word, even before we think about what it has done to us. Gold catches light without seeming to consume it. Gold does not rust into sadness like iron. It does not turn green and mournful like copper left too long in weather. It stays itself. It keeps a strange calm. I think that may be part of why people so easily let sacred things gather around it. Gold looks patient, eternal, a little inhuman. And then the story gives it motive. Somewhere beyond Earth, according to the boldest version, there was another world, a failing world, a world whose own atmosphere was weakening, a world whose people, if people is even the right word, turned outward in desperation and found this planet rich in water, rich in life, and rich in the metal they needed. Not for crowns, not for vanity, for survival. It is a powerful opening. Too powerful, perhaps. That is often the first warning sign with stories like this. They fit the emotional shape of a myth so neatly that the mind wants them to be true before the evidence has even entered the room. But emotional neatness is not the same thing as truth. The older I get, the more I think truth usually arrives looking slightly rumpled and mildly annoyed to be there at all. Still, we should not rush past the seduction. The theory endures because it understands something intimate about people. We do not like to think of ourselves as accidental. Even when the evidence leans in that direction, we want the first page of our story to contain intention. We want the heavens to have looked down with need or curiosity. We want human labor, especially the hardest and ugliest labor, to connect to something larger than simple hunger and survival. If you were standing here with me, listening to this in the glow of a late fire, I suspect that is the point where the story would begin to tighten around you. Not at the mention of aliens or gods, not even at the mention of gold. It would tighten when you realize what the theory actually offers. It offers purpose where ordinary history offers process. It offers design where evolution offers adaptation. It offers a master plan where archaeology usually offers fragments, probabilities, and a great deal of scholarly sighing. And then, almost like a stage curtain lifting, one name steps forward. Zecharia Sitchin. Now there is something quietly theatrical about him already. A journaliste. A businessman. An outsider. A man not trained as the official scholars were trained, and therefore perfectly shaped for the role of the person who claims to see what the experts missed. Our age loves that figure. It cannot resist him. He opens an old text, leans over a broken word, and announces that history has been hiding in plain sight. That is catnip for the modern mind. He published The 12th Planet in 1976, and the timing mattered. Space travel had become real enough to enter the blood. The moon landing was no longer fantasy. Governments were distrusted. Institutions looked brittle. Old authorities seemed less sacred than they once had. Into that atmosphere came a man holding clay tablets in one hand and a cosmic secret in the other. According to his reading, the Sumerians were not simply the first civilization. They were the inheritors of knowledge from beyond Earth. Their gods were not gods in the symbolic or theological sense, but physical beings, the Anunnaki. Not spiritual rulers of heaven and underworld, but visitors, arrivals, those who from heaven to earth came. It is a line that lands well in the ear, which should also make us suspicious. The most durable mistranslations are often the ones that sound best when spoken slowly. But before skepticism wakes up fully, the imagination has already begun its work. Clay tablets stop being ritual texts and become coded reports. Ziggurats stop being sacred mountains and become remnants of contact. Gold stops being prestige and becomes supply. The Sumerians themselves, of course, are real enough, and that matters. We are not drifting through total fantasy here. They really did emerge in southern Mesopotamia around the 5th millennium before the Common Era. They really did create one of the first writing systems. They really did build city-states, canals, temples, and the administrative machinery of early urban life. They really did divide time and number in ways we still carry around in every clock in every circle. That reality gives the theory its footing. Without a genuinely astonishing civilization at the center, the rest collapses much faster. And honestly, the Sumerians are so extraordinary in the plain human sense that one can understand why people keep trying to hand their brilliance away to something non-human. It feels less demanding that way. If aliens taught them, then the sharp, early rise of civilization is not so unsettling. If gods handed down order, then perhaps we do not have to grapple so directly with what human beings can become when memory, lavor, and environment align at the right moment. But the ancient world itself did believe in the Anunnaki. That part is not fringe at all. The word is real. The beings are real within the textual tradition. They appear across Sumerian and later Mesopotamian literature as major divine powers, celestial authorities, rulers, judges, and shapers of destiny. Enlil, Enki, Inanna, Nanna, Utu, the whole great radiant cast. To the ancient Mesopotamians, they were not literary decoration. They were woven into the structure of reality. That is where the quiet tension begins. Because once the gods are real inside the culture, a modern writer can always ask the dangerous follow-up question. Real in what way? Were they real as worshipped powers within a symbolic universe? Or real as misremembered visitors whose technology later hardened into myth? That is the exact crack in the door through which the whole theory slips. The story wants us to stand at that crack and look through it. It wants us to see a long corridor where sacred language and literal memory blur together, where divine descent might really mean descent, where creation from clay might really mean some primitive memory of biological manipulation, where labor demanded by the gods might conceal something uglier and more concrete than a theology of agriculture. The corridor is dark, yes, but it is very well designed. That is why people keep walking into it. Outside that corridor, though, other voices are already clearing their throats. Scholars of Mesopotamian language, Assyriologists, Sumerologists, people who have spent decades with these tablets, are not generally impressed by the glamorous version. They point to grammar, to lexical lists, to bilingual dictionaries left by ancient scribes themselves. They say that the translations on which the whole cosmic mining story rests are not bold discoveries, but distortions. That dispute will matter more as we go on. For now, it is enough to feel the first split opening beneath the theory. On one side, a lonely prehistoric Earth, a metal of divine permanence, and visitors with a desperate need. On the other, a very human tendency to overread what we most want to be true. Between those two sides sits the clay, patient as ever, saying only what it says, and never once hurrying to rescue us from our own interpretations. By the end of this first movement, the metal should already feel heavier than it did at the start. Not because we know the answer yet, but because gold has been pulled into a deeper field of meaning. It gleams in temple treasuries. It gleams in theories of lost worlds. It gleams in the human longing to believe that someone older, higher, more knowing, once needed something from this planet, badly enough to shape our fate around it. And from there, the next step is inevitable. We have to leave the seduction of the story for a while and enter the sharper, drier room where words themselves are examined. We have to ask what the tablets actually say, what Anunnaki actually means, what Nibiru actually was in the texts, whether the great cosmic gold hunger is hidden in the old language or only projected into it by a much later imagination that could not bear how ordinary and how magnificent the real human story already was. If the first part of the mystery belongs to atmosphere, this part belongs to language, and language is always less forgiving. One can dream almost anything into an old civilization from a distance. Up close, the grammar begins to interfere. The wedge marks begin to insist on being read carefully. And careful reading is rarely the friend of dramatic certainty. I have always liked that about ancient texts. They are glamorous only until you actually meet them. Then they become stubborn, technical, sometimes repetitive, full of lexical traps and inherited meanings that refuse to cooperate with whatever modern hunger you arrived carrying. A clay tablet does not care what story will sell best. It does not care what theory will make the internet whisper more excitedly in the dark. It only keeps its small press signs and waits. So let us walk into the drier room now. Shelves, copies, photographs, reference works, transliteration tables, dictionaries compiled not by modern romantics, but by ancient scribes themselves, who had the mild advantage of actually speaking the languages in question. The fire in our room is still warm, but the air inside this scholarly chamber is cooler, less forgiving. Good. Mysteries need at least one room like that. The first name under the lamp is Anunnaki. In mainstream Mesopotamian scholarship, the Anunnaki are not invented. They are entirely real as part of the textual and religious world of ancient Mesopotamia. That must be said plainly because some people imagine skeptics deny their existence altogether. Not so. The debate is not whether the word exists. The debate is what kind of beings the word described. Gods in the theological framework of Sumer, Akkad, Assyria, and Babylon. Yes, physical extraterrestrials descended from another planet. That is where the floor begins to crack. The academic translation generally points towards something like princely offspring, or those of royal blood, connected to the great divine lineage descending from An, the sky god, and Ki, the earth goddess. They are cosmic powers. They decree destinies. They govern. They receive offerings. They are woven through myth and cult in the way gods tend to be. This is not vague, and it is not embarrassing. It is the normal language of Mesopotamian religion. But that is not the phrase that caught the modern imagination by the throat. The phrase that did that was the one Sitchin preferred. Those who from heaven to earth came. It has movement in it. Descent. Arrival. It opens a door and lets cinema pour through. You can almost hear the soundtrack. You know that feeling when a sentence sounds so good that part of you wants it to be true even before the footnotes arrive. This is exactly that kind of sentence. Michael Heiser, among many others, spent a great deal of time trying to close that door with patient lexical work. He argued that the celebrated fringe translations were unsupported, sometimes wildly so, and that one could not simply take a term from the Sumerian or Akkadian world and squeeze it until it produced rockets, astronauts, and hidden planets. Heiser was not alone. Across the field, the response was remarkably consistent. The words do not mean what Sitchin says they mean. That is not a glamorous rebuttal, which may be why it never spread as joyfully as the original claim. It does not offer a cosmic secret. It offers morphology. It offers lexical history. It offers the old scholarly ritual of saying, gently but firmly, no, that sign cluster carries a more ordinary meaning than the one you wanted. Very few people fall asleep thrilled by morphology, and yet tonight it matters very much. Take the word Shem, for example. In fringe retellings, it becomes a rocket ship, a celestial vehicle, something pointed upward and useful for leaving worlds behind. In mainstream scholarship, the meaning is painfully less exciting. Name, reputation, fame, legacy. Not a vessel, but an identity. Not something launched, but something established. It is a smaller word, and a much more human one. There is something almost funny about that. An entire machine disappears into a noun for prestige. But that is precisely the sort of humiliation bad theories deserve. They are not usually slain by giant counter-theories. They are usually killed by dictionaries. And then there is Nibiru, perhaps the most famous of the contested words. In the grand narrative, Nibiru becomes the lost home world, a massive planetary body traveling on an immense, elongated orbit that swings through the inner solar system every 3,600 years. It is a wonderful image. Distant darkness, long return, civilizational desperation. One almost regrets having to ruin it. The cuneiform evidence, however, is far less cooperative. In the actual Mesopotamian astronomical materials, Nibiru refers in different contexts to a crossing point, sometimes to Jupiter, sometimes to Mercury, sometimes to Marduk in a celestial role, sometimes to a star. It does not behave like the hidden planet of the later theory. It behaves like an ancient astronomical term inside a symbolic and observational system the Mesopotamians actually used. There is no textual basis for a giant undiscovered world beyond Pluto making periodic visits like an overdue relative. That matters, because once Nibiru loses its role, the rest of the story has to work much harder to stand upright. No distant world in crisis. No clear home for the gold seekers. No elegant orbital timetable explaining why the gods come and go. The architecture of the theory remains dramatically satisfying, but one of its main load-bearing columns begins to crumble. And this is where many listeners feel the first real disappointment. I understand that disappointment. There is a peculiar sadness in watching a magnificent idea shrink back into ordinary philology. But disappointment is not always a sign that the truth is less beautiful. Sometimes it is only a sign that the truth has less makeup on. The Sumerians themselves, by the way, knew a good deal about the visible heavens. That is another reason this matters. Their astronomy, and later Babylonian astronomy built on it, was serious and sustained. They tracked the wandering bodies visible to the naked eye. Venus, Jupiter, Mars, Saturn, Mercury, along with Sun and Moon. They watched, counted, predicted, developed systems of striking precision over time. If a hidden giant world on a spectacular orbit had been part of their actual observational tradition, one would expect clearer textual support than what fringe readings provide. It is simply not there. Still, the theory survives. And one reason it survives is that most people do not encounter these words in a university seminar. They encounter them in a story first. A story told with confidence. A story in which the outsider sees through the blindness of the experts. That narrative shape is very strong in modern culture. The lone decoder, the stubborn scholar against the establishment, the old text saying what the institutions refuse to admit. It is all very effective. Suspicion becomes emotionally rewarding. Every objection from the field can then be reinterpreted as proof of suppression. That is the paradox we have to carry for the rest of the journey. The more experts protest, the more some audiences feel confirmed, opposition becomes fuel. Debunking becomes evidence of a cover-up. At that point, the theory stops being about tablets alone and becomes about identity, about belonging to the group that sees what others refuse to see. If you were standing here with me, I would probably say this is where the whole conversation turns less archaeological and more psychological. Not yet completely, but enough to feel it. Why are certain mistranslations so beloved? Why do certain cosmic possibilities become emotionally irresistible, even when the language grows increasingly less friendly to them? Why does the glamorous story survive the dictionary? Part of the answer, I think, is that language itself can feel treacherous when old myths are involved. Ancient religions did describe gods descending, ascending, shaping destinies, issuing commands, revealing knowledge, receiving precious materials, riding in splendor, moving through sky and underworld. If one is determined enough, these patterns can always be literalized. A divine court becomes a political hierarchy of visitors. A celestial crossing point becomes a home world. A name becomes a vehicle. A myth becomes a report. The transformation is not random. It follows the grain of desire. And yet the texts remain what they are. They are religious literature, political memory, theology, ritual language, cosmic explanation. They speak from a Bronze Age world that did not separate religion from government, or myth from authority, as neatly as modern people like to pretend. When the Anunnaki appear, they appear as gods in that world, and that is not a boring answer. It is the real one. The frustration many modern readers feel may say more about our discomfort with symbolic meaning than about any secret hidden in the tablets. There is another human thing going on here, too. The more technical the academic correction becomes, the less emotionally nourishing it feels. To say that a term means name instead of spacecraft is linguistically useful, but spiritually thin. To say that Nibiru is a crossing point or a known planet in ancient astronomy is precise, but not intoxicating. The fringe narrative wins hearts because it feeds them. Scholarship often wins only the argument. Honestly, that may be one reason the theory flourished so spectacularly. It offered a dramatic totality, It gave people a complete answer to where we came from, why labor exists, why gold matters, and whether we are alone. Linguistic caution offers no such feast. It offers a smaller meal. Correct, perhaps, but smaller. Still, we need the smaller meal. Without it, the rest becomes shapeless. Tonight, the point is not to strip all wonder from the tablets. The point is to make sure our wonder rests on what they can bear. The Anunnaki remain powerful. Gold remains radiant. The Sumerians remain astonishing. What changes is the confidence with which we can say the old texts literally describe extraterrestrial miners. That confidence, under the lamp of language, begins to thin. By the end of this movement, the room should feel a little different. The opening seduction is still there, but it has been interrupted by sign lists, dictionaries, and the rude little miracle that ancient scribes often understood their own words better than modern sensation seekers. That may sound obvious, but obvious truths are often the hardest to keep in the room. And from here, the next movement becomes clearer and stranger at the same time. If the language will not easily support the full cosmic mining story, then why did the theory still lock so tightly onto gold? Why was gold so powerful in the actual ancient world? Why did Mesopotamia, a land without native gold deposits, still gather the metal into temples, tombs, and prestige objects with such relentless seriousness? To answer that, we have to come back down from disputed translation and follow the real gold itself, along trade routes, into treasuries, into graves, and eventually into the oldest and most haunting labor stories of all. The theory grows larger now, and in a strange way, more fragile, because once the words begin to resist the most dramatic translation, the entire weight of the story shifts onto its grand cosmic frame. If the tablets do not openly hand us alien miners in neat, plain language, then perhaps the larger architecture will do the work instead. This is the moment when the dark sky opens, when the imagined world called Nibiru begins to drift forward, and when gold stops being an ornament and becomes a necessity. I want to move slowly here, because this is the part of the story that most easily turns loud, and loudness ruins the mood. In the strongest version of the claim, there was another planet, Alcyon, massive, wounded, circling the sun in an enormous, elongated path. Not a neighboring world that watched Earth from a modest distance, but a remote and periodic one, returning only after spans of time so long that human history would look like a flicker against its schedule. On that world, according to the theory, something had gone wrong with the atmosphere. Protection was thinning. Survival itself had begun to feel uncertain. And somewhere in the logic of that crisis, gold became the answer. It is an intoxicating image. A sky on another world turning colder and less forgiving. A civilization old enough to manipulate matter on scales we still dramatize in fiction. Scientists, rulers, engineers, or God, like authorities, looking upward and outward and deciding that if their own air could no longer hold, then some substance capable of preserving or repairing it had to be found. Gold, ground fine, suspended, scattered, turned into a shield. I understand why that image refuses to die. It gives the metal a reason vast enough to justify all the human madness that later gathered around it. If you were sitting by a window in the dark while hearing that image for the first time, you would probably feel the same cold pull many people have felt. Gold is no longer just wealth. It becomes medicine for a dying sky. And then Earth appears beneath that imagined gaze. Blue, vet, dense with life, rich in rivers, weather, mud, and buried mineral promise. In the theory, our world becomes less a home than a solution. A deposit. A place whose value is not in its beauty, though that may be noted too, but in what lies hidden in its crust. Gold under stone. Gold in veins. Gold in places where labor will one day have to go down into darkness to reach it. I have always thought this is the point where the theory feels most emotionally complete, not because it is best supported there. It is not, but because every part of the story suddenly snaps together. Distant need, earthly resource, powerful arrivals, a reason to intervene, a reason to organize labor, a reason that seems greater than mythology and more chilling than ordinary greed. Once the metal becomes cosmic necessity, everything below it can be arranged into purpose. That purpose, in the theory, becomes colonization. The visitors do not come here for worship. They do not come simply to admire. They come for extraction. There is something almost bleakly modern about that. For all the cosmic distance and ancient atmosphere, the motive is painfully familiar. Need something. Find a place that has it. Build a system to get it out. Whether the system is called empire, colone, concession, contract, occupation, or divine rule hardly matters to the people under it. The labor remains labor. This is where the Anunnaki story is at its most seductive. The beings of the old Mesopotamian texts become not gods in the symbolic or theological sense, but administrators of a resource operation. Senior authorities above, workers below. Technical knowledge concentrated in the ruling group. Earth gradually transformed into a site whose value is measured through supply. You know that feeling when a myth suddenly starts sounding like an industry. That is what happens here. But we need to keep the room honest. Mainstream astronomy does not support the planet as described in this theory. There is no accepted evidence for a massive world on such an orbit entering the inner solar system every 3,600 years. A body of that scale would leave effects, gravitational signatures, disruptions that would not politely hide from celestial mechanics. The heavens are not subtle enough to keep a secret that large. If such a planet were moving through the neighborhood on that schedule, the rest of the solar system would complain about it very loudly. That matters because it reveals something important about the theory's emotional structure. The farther it moves from philology into cosmology, the more it depends on the listener wanting it to work. Wanting can carry a story very far. It just cannot carry a planet. Still, the image of gold as technological necessity remains haunting, and I do not think we should dismiss that too quickly. Not because it proves anything extraterrestrial, but because it says something revealing about how modern minds relate to ancient treasure. We no longer feel comfortable with pure sacredness. To say that gold mattered because it gleamed like immortality and resisted corruption is somehow not enough for many listeners. We want a harder reason, a utilitarian reason, a scientific reason. Even our myths now ask for engineering support. Honestly, that may be one reason this story flourished. It lets the ancient world keep its gods while translating them into a language modern people trust more. Technology, survival, resource scarcity, planetary crisis. It is mythology recoded for an age that no longer wants to admit it still thinks mythically. If you were with me beside the fire, I would probably pause here and let that thought breathe a little, because it softens the whole argument without making it dull. Even when a theory overreaches, it can still reveal the hunger that produced it. And here, the hunger is obvious. We want ancient religion to have a technical core. We want old divinity to hide practical intelligence. We want the sacred to justify itself in materials and machinery. Gold is perfect for that role because gold already straddles both worlds. It is mystical and measurable, sacred and conductive, decorative and chemically stubborn. It looks like glory. And modern people also know it can function inside complex technologies. Once those two layers are held together, the leap from temple offering to atmospheric shield becomes emotionally shorter than it should be. The source material wisely keeps its distance from certainty here, and we should do the same. We can let the theory unfold in its full shape without pretending the shape proves itself. A planet increases. A metal that matters. Earth as answer. The Anunnaki as arrivals under necessity, not whim. Human beings later drawn into that machinery of extraction. It is a powerful tale, but power and truth do not always sleep in the same bed. There is another detail worth lingering over. The theory assumes an advanced civilization that still depends on a brute resource solution. That itself is strangely human. For all its cosmic scale, the story does not imagine transcendence. It imagines logistics, shortage, procurement, work. Even the gods end up sounding like a troubled empire with a supply problem. That may be why the tale feels believable to some people. It does not ask us to imagine perfect beings. It asks us to imagine stressed ones. And stressed systems always come looking for labor. That labor piece will matter even more later when we reach Atrahasis. But it is already present here in outline. If Earth is a mining world, then someone has to go into the ground. Someone has to carry, zoe, refine, or transport. Someone has to bear the repetitive burden that a ruling class, divine or otherwise, would rather not bear itself forever. Suddenly, the old Mesopotamian creation stories begin to look less symbolic to those who favor the theory. Humans are not made from clay because clay is poetic. They are made because workers are needed. That reinterpretation is not supported by the texts in the strict sense, but it grows naturally from the cosmic gold frame once that frame is accepted. The darker mood of the story enters here. Not because we have proven anything terrible, but because the possibility being entertained is so cold. A species or ruling order arrives in need. A planet is evaluated. The buried metal matters more than the creatures already crawling over the mud. Eventually, a labor solution is produced. That is empire at its most stripped down. Need first. Life second. The river world of Mesopotamia will later clothe that memory, if memory it was, in hymns and divine names and sacred lineages. But here in the theory's most severe form, the old beauty of temple culture is cast backward under a harder light. The gold in a sanctuary is not simply honor. It is residue. The gleam in a royal tomb is not just splendor. It is the surviving perfume of extraction. Again, I am not saying the evidence demands this. It does not. I am saying the theory becomes emotionally coherent here in a way many listeners immediately understand. That coherence is part of its survival. Let us bring the sky back for a moment before we descend to the earth more fully. Imagine the night over the first Sumerian cities, the moon bright over water channels, the stars steady in their cold old places, priests watching, numbing, counting. Somewhere within that same sky culture, later readers will imagine a hidden, returning world, a slow, dark body carrying the memory of its own atmospheric wound. It is a beautiful sadness, really, a civilization in the heavens needing something from the soil below, the sort of sadness that makes a myth feel personal. But the ground must answer now, because if gold truly sits at the center of this theory, then the next question is not what distant worlds needed. The next question is what the real ancient Near East actually did with gold. How much it had. Where it got it. Why Mesopotamia, a land without native gold deposits, still gathered the metal into temples, tombs, and prestige objects with such seriousness. The sky story is powerful, but the next movement has to lower us into storerooms, trade routes, and tombs. We need to see the metal in human hands before we can judge what kind of dream later minds laid over it. There is one more softness in this cosmic section that should not be lost. For all its machinery of extraction, the theory still depends on longing. Longing for the idea that human beginnings mattered to someone beyond the human world. Longing for an explanation large enough to justify suffering. Longing for the thought that labor, even brutal labor, was attached to a design rather than born from ordinary scarcity and ordinary power. That longing is part of the evidence, too. Not evidence for alien miners, but evidence for why the story survives. A myth does not last simply because it is strange. It lasts because it gives emotional order to fear. Gold as planetary medicine. Earth as chosen source. Humanity as necessary workforce. It is a cruel design, but it is still a design. And people often prefer cruel meaning to meaningless hardship. Once the story comes down from the sky, the metal itself becomes more interesting, and in a quieter way, more dangerous. A distant planet in trouble is easy to dramatize. A gold cup in a dark tomb is harder, because it is real. It has weight. It reflects lamplight. It asks not what if, but who touched me last? And why did they believe I belonged with the dead? Mesopotamia is a strange place to begin a gold story if one thinks only in geological terms. The southern river plain was rich in mud, reeds, fish, bitumen, clay, lavor, and eventually writing. but it was not rich in native gold deposits. That fact matters more than it first appears to. Gold in Sumer was not local abundance lying around waiting to become jewelry. It had to come from elsewhere. It had to move. That already gives the metal a peculiar dignity. Whatever else gold was, it was effort concentrated into brightness. Imagine a shipment arriving after distance. Pack animals tired. Carriers dusty. Guards watchful in that quiet way all guards become when they know the cargo is small enough to steal and valuable enough to start blood feuds. The bags are opened, or the ingots unwrapped, or the ornaments revealed from padded cloth. Not a mountain of wealth. Gold seldom behaves that way in the real ancient world. More often it appears in measured amounts, enough to transform a treasury, enough to dress a cult statue, enough to crown a burial, enough to make a room feel that eternity has briefly touched it. I have always thought imported gold carries a different emotion than mined gold. Mined gold still remembers the earth. Imported gold remembers distance. The source material rightly turns toward the royal cemetery of at this stage. Because if one wants to feel the force of gold in early Mesopotamia, one could hardly ask for a more haunting setting. Deep graves, bodies laid down with care, quiet arrangements of luxury around the stillness of death, cups, headdresses, ornaments, worked surfaces that somehow continue to gleam through the ruin of almost everything else. Gold there is not casual wealth. It is ritual concentration, a material trusted to accompany rank into silence. Picture one of those royal burials before the earth closed over it. Torchlight low and warm. The air heavy, perhaps with oil, perhaps with perfume, perhaps only with the breath of too many anxious people in one confined place. Someone lifts a worked gold object and places it near a body that will not rise again. The metal catches the fire and answers it softly, not with the cheap glitter of modern things, but with a dense old glow. That glow must have seemed like a promise, or perhaps like a refusal to perish. Gold does not decay the way flesh does. That alone can make it sacred very quickly. This is the point where the human explanation begins to show its full strength. Ancient people did not need extraterrestrial miners to teach them that a metal which resists corruption feels divine. They only needed eyes and grief, and the steady, humiliating fact that everything living rots. Gold in Mesopotamia became the material of temples, elite, and ceremonial authority because it condensed rarity, beauty, endurance, and distance into one object. It had traveled. It had survived. It gleamed under light in a way nothing else quite did. It did not stain the hands with green or red. It did not crumble. It sat there with an almost insulting calm, as if time itself had less purchase on it than on ordinary matter. That is exactly the sort of substance ancient religions fall in love with. And still, because the metal had to be imported, trade enters the story like a long, quiet river under everything else. Mesopotamia did not produce its gold easily. It acquired it through exchange networks stretching toward Anatolia, Iran, perhaps farther at times, and later through broader, interconnected systems. That means every gold object in a Sumerian context carries invisible geography inside it. Mountains, roots, bargains, escorts, delays, risks. The temple treasury is never just a treasury. It is a map folded into metal. You know that feeling when a beautiful thing becomes more beautiful only after you understand how far it traveled to get there. That is what happens with gold in this world. The source script also toys with the stronger speculative claim that temples may have functioned as collection points in a broader extraction network. This is where the mood must stay balanced. In the mainstream view, temples were treasuries because temples were economic hearts of city-states. They received tribute, controlled land, organized labor, and stored precious materials for cultic and political reasons. One does not need alien logistics to explain why the house of a god also became the place where rare metal accumulated. That is how sacred power works in human history, again and again. Still, once the larger theory has entered the room, even ordinary temple storage begins to look a little different. A votive bowl becomes a retained shipment. A decorative panel becomes processed output. A sacred reserve becomes inventory. The theory has a way of changing the emotional temperature of objects that archaeology would otherwise describe soberly. That is part of its strange talent. It does not invent the objects. It changes what kind of desire we think produced them. Honestly, that is one of the reasons people love theories like this. They turn every artifact into a clue rather than a conclusion. But let us remain with the real Sumerian world a while longer, because it deserves that respect. Gold there was not common money sliding through market stalls by the fistful. Silver more often handled the practical side of exchange in many Mesopotamian contexts. Gold was set apart, reserved, elevated, drawn into cult statues, ornaments, ritual vessels, burial assemblage, elite display. The metal was not useful because it circulated everywhere. It was useful because it did not. Restriction magnified its force. If you entered a temple storeroom at night, perhaps after the main rites had ended and the city outside had lowered itself into its ordinary darkness, the atmosphere would be almost unbearable in its stillness. Containers, seals, hidden recesses, textiles covering sacred goods. Somewhere behind them, objects of gold waiting for the next ceremony or the next display of divine presence. A lamp moved too quickly would set brief flashes running over their surfaces. Then darkness again. That intermittent gleam feels important. Gold likes to appear and disappear. It teaches reverence through scarcity. The source transcript understands that gold's symbolic role cannot be dismissed as superficial. Even if one rejects every extraterrestrial claim, the metal remains charged. That is why the story does not weaken when it returns to real archaeology. In some ways, it becomes stronger, because now the listener can see how easily a brilliant, imported, incorruptible material would attract sacred explanation without needing any secret mining order from the stars. I have always found the tension between tomb and temple especially revealing. In the temple, gold honors the god, or rather, the visible seat of the god within the city. In the tomb, it honors the dead, or perhaps helps the dead move into a different kind of continuity. In both cases, the metal stands at a border between mortal and divine, between ordinary matter and matter that refuses ordinary decay, between this world and whatever waits just behind it. That border quality may be more than enough to explain its old prestige. And yet the larger theory keeps whispering, because prestige is not the same as need. Sacred use does not erase practical hunger. A temple treasury full of gold can still be reimagined as a storage point in a bigger system. A burial ornament can still be treated as spillover from an extraction world. The theory clings because it exploits the very real intensity of ancient gold culture. It does not invent the intensity. It redirects it. There is also something worth saying about the size of the ancient gold record. People sometimes imagine that if the Anunnaki truly needed Earth's gold in colossal quantities, the archaeological record should look like mountains stripped bare and rivers turned inside out. It does not look that way in Sumer itself. What we see instead are prestige concentrations, beautiful and meaningful, but not evidence of local mass extraction on a planetary rescue scale. That gap matters. It does not end the theory by itself, but it weakens the emotional smoothness of it. The real ancient world was lavish in pockets, not an endless metallic flood. If you were a Sumerian artisan working gold, your experience of the metal would be intimate. Heat, hammer, thin sheets shaped over cores, wire, attachments, surface finishing, the object small in the hand, but carrying immense symbolic charge once complete. That human scale also matters. Gold in Sumer is often personal before it is cosmic. A coupe, a headdress, a bowl, a fitting, a bead, a funerary object resting near a face that no longer breathes. The theory wants industrial enormity. The archaeology so often gives us crafted nearness. That nearness, I think, is one of the most beautiful rebuttals to the grand mining fantasy. Though it is not a full rebuttal. It reminds us that ancient people needed no alien motive in order to become entranced by this metal. They had hands, eyes, death, ritual, power, distance, trade, memory. All the necessary ingredients were already there. Still, the room should not lose its unease. Mesopotamia, lacking native gold, is exactly why the story can now travel farther. If the metal came from elsewhere, we have to ask from where. If certain later fringe traditions insist the answer lies deep in Africa, in ancient shafts and buried labor, we must follow that trail next. Because the real power of the gold theory does not lie in temple bowls alone. It lies underground, in the darker image of workers descending into the earth for something they may not even understand, while those above them name the work sacred, royal, or necessary. So let the torchlight fade from the tomb at Ur. Let the gold settle back into darkness. Let the storehouses close. Let the metal carry its full burden of beauty and suspicion. The next movement goes downward, into mines, into red earth, into prehistoric claims and contested evidence, where the dream of Anunnaki gold hunger becomes more claustrophobic, more physical, and much harder to separate from the oldest human story of all, the story of bodies sent underground to bring something bright back up. There is also the quiet fact that once gold enters ritual life, it begins to teach memory. A child sees it only on holy days. A mourner sees it beside the dead. A worker may never touch it at all and still spend years carrying grain or brick for institutions that store it behind sealed doors. In that way, gold becomes larger than its physical quantity. It becomes social weather. Even a small amount can dominate imagination if it is placed where only rulers, priests, and corpses seem allowed to keep company with it. That old arrangement helps explain why later theories could wrap so much around the metal. The emotional field was already prepared by centuries of reverence. The story grows narrower now and darker because gold is no longer sitting safely in temple light. It is going down into the earth. That shift matters. In a shrine, gold can still pretend to be beauty, or holiness, or a promise that death will not take everything. In a mine, gold loses most of its manners. It becomes labor. It becomes heat, stone, breath, dust, and the old human fact that anything bright enough will eventually send someone underground after it. The source material turns toward Africa here, and it does so for a reason that is both archaeological and emotional. If Mesopotamia did not possess rich native gold deposits of its own, then the mind begins to travel. It follows trade routes first, then rumors, then maps, then the more dangerous instinct, the instinct to let the blank spaces fill with purpose. Southern Africa, with its real ancient mining traditions and its vast geological richness, becomes the perfect stage for that instinct. The ground there is real. The shafts are real. The labor is real. Only the dates and the hidden masters become uncertain. Imagine the first descent into such a place. Not as a modern mine with neat lights and metal rails and stern safety notices nailed to the wall, but as a wound in the red earth. The opening is narrow. The air changes as soon as you bend into it. Outside, there is wind and sky and bird sound. Inside, there is breath, heat held too long, and the smell of stone that does not want to be broken. A torch or lamp carries only a little courage. It shows enough wall to keep fear honest, not enough to make the passage feel safe. I have always thought tunnels have a way of stripping stories down to their bare essentials. Above ground, people can still decorate the world with theory. Below ground, theory gives way to lungs. How much air is there? How much farther? How much rock remains? How much weight sits over the skull? Gold becomes very simple underground. It is what men crawl toward because something above them has decided it matters more than comfort. The mainstream archaeological record is careful here, and it deserves to be spoken carefully. There is genuine evidence of very ancient mining in parts of southern Africa. The site at Ngwenya in Eswatini is famous for that, with prehistoric extraction going back astonishingly far. But the widely accepted interpretation centers on ochre, not gold. Red mineral, pigmon, symbolic and practical material valued for body, ritual, and perhaps early industry of a different kind. That matters. It is not a footnote. It is the difference between what the shaft proves and what later imaginations want the shaft to prove. Still, even ochre mining should not be treated lightly. A human group willing to cut into the earth for colored stone is already telling us something profound. Beauty, ritual, and symbolic need can drive labor almost as powerfully as metal wealth. Ancient people did not need greed alone to go underground. Meaning was enough. That is one reason the later gold theory catches so well. It lands in a species already familiar with digging for what shines, stain, transforms, or sanctifies. Then the timeline advances, and the record becomes clearer in other places. Gold production in regions connected later with Mapungubwe and Great Zimbabwe is real, substantial, and historically important. Trade moved precious material outward. Elites gathered it. Networks formed around it. But this is much later than the extravagant fringe claims that try to push gold extraction back into unimaginable antiquity. The great temptation of the fringe narrative is to smooth all those centuries flat and say, there. The mines were always for the same thing, always under the same hidden purpose. History almost never behaves that neatly. You know that feeling when a line on a map looks direct until you actually walk it. Then every valley and ridge returns and reminds you that distance was always real. That is how chronology behaves too. The old theory wants one continuous drama. Archaeology keeps giving us intervals, breaks, different uses, different peoples, different scales of labor, and yet the image remains powerful. Men underground, red dust or glittering flecks in lamplight, narrow shafts, stone circles on the surface. The possibility, however unsupported in strict terms, that the earth beneath Africa hides not only mineral wealth, but memories too old and too broken to classify easily. This is one of the places where the source material is strongest emotionally. Even when it must remain cautious factually, it understands that underground labor carries a mythic charge all its own. The mine is one of the oldest theaters of human darkness. If you were standing at the mouth of one of those shafts at dusk, watching workers emerge one by one, you would not need an alien theory to feel the gravity of the place. Dust in hair, dust at the nostrils, dust in the folds of the cloth, bent shoulders, the slight confusion of the eyes as they return to open light. Something has been taken from below. Someone above values it. The whole pattern is already present. A hidden resource. A hierarchy of need. Bodies sent down to fetch brightness back into the world of command. Honestly, that pattern may be why the Anunnaki gold story survives as well as it does. It does not invent human experience. It enlarges it. It takes an old arrangement that has existed in many cultures. Rulers or sacred centers valuing some deep, hidden material enough to demand exhausting labor, and simply lifts the scale upward until the rulers become cosmic. That is a very effective move. The body recognizes the structure even when the mind questions the details. The source transcript also nods toward ancient stone circles and abandoned workings that fringe writers love to gather into one ominous pile. Here the tone has to remain steady. Some sites are real. Some dates are real. Some interpretations are imaginative in ways that exceed the evidence by miles. One cannot build a strong case by letting every unresolved feature in the landscape become proof of extraterrestrial industry. The earth is old enough to produce mysteries without help, and humans are fully capable of abandoning difficult works in ways that later generations find eerie. Still, eerie is not worthless. Eerie is often where real questions begin. A line of old stones under hot sky. A cut in bedrock whose purpose is no longer obvious. A tunnel worn smooth by hands long gone. These do not prove the fringe claim, but they keep the emotional gate open. They remind us how easy it is for labor to outlast explanation. I think that is one reason this section belongs in a sleep story. Underground work has a muffled quality to it. Sound changes. Time changes. The body loses its ordinary relation today. A mine is almost a second world. The listener can feel that instinctively. Once humans go down after something bright, the act itself begins to gather symbolism. Descent, extraction, return, wealth wrestled from darkness. It is nearly impossible not to turn such labor into myth eventually. And then the old Mesopotamian narratives begin drifting back into view, because they too speak of labor imposed from above. Not gold yet in the strict textual sense, but burden, duty, work done for powers beyond the worker. That bridge matters. African mining, real or exaggerated in date, gives the imagination the underground scene it wants. Atrahasis will soon give it the textual scene it wants. Exhausted higher beings, angry labor, a replacement workforce shaped from clay. Once those two scenes touch, the theory feels almost complete, even if the evidence underneath it remains uneven. If you were with me beside the fire, I think this is where the room would become especially quiet. The mine has that effect even in imagination. It lowers everything. It makes speech feel too large. The body in the shaft, the narrowness, the low roof, the bad air, the little lamp trying not to fail. All of it shrinks language into something practical. Move, lift, pass, turn, breathe. That shrinking belongs to the deeper motifs of this whole series. Great theories are always built on small bodies doing repetitive things in difficult places. There is a trace of humor here, too, though it is the dry sort. Modern people love cosmic theories because they sound glamorous. But every glamorous theory about resource extraction eventually ends with someone sweating in a hole. There is no grand way around that. Even the gods, if they want metal badly enough, end up needing a workforce and a tunnel. That truth is so ordinary that it almost feels noble. The real archaeological story of ancient African mining is already impressive enough without embellishment. It shows skill, persistence, local knowledge, long memory, and the capacity to organize labor around something hidden beneath the surface. The fringe version inflates the timescale and installs heavenly supervisors. The emotional machinery is easy to see once you know where to look. Great depth below, great need above, humans in the middle. There is another reason underground labor fits this story so tightly. Mines distort time. A shaft can make an hour feel like an afternoon and a season feel like one long, unbroken task. Ancient people knew that. They did not need abstract philosophy to tell them that descent changes the body. The ears strain. The backgrounds. The hands learn the wall better than the horizon. Once a culture has enough generations of that experience, it will begin to surround the mind with stories. Because no one goes down into darkness for shining matter without eventually asking what sort of powers asked for the shining matter in the first place. And so the image becomes older and heavier. The overseer at the top, the worker below, the bright thing somewhere still deeper in the rock. Whether the master is king, priest, merchant, or god, barely changes the feel of the arrangement to the body doing the digging. That is why later readers could look at ancient shafts and ancient myths and let them merge. The human structure was already there, waiting to be enlarged into something cosmic. Even without accepting the extraterrestrial frame, one truth remains. Deep extraction changes the imagination of every culture that depends on it. Once brightness must be won from buried darkness. The earth itself begins to feel like a guarded treasury. That feeling can feed religion, kingship, and fantasy all at once. And that middle position is where our story must now go next. Because whatever happened in prehistoric minds, the most powerful text in the entire alien labor theory is not African stone at all. It is a Mesopotamian poem, Atrahasis. There, in language no one disputes exists, the gods really do grow weary of labor. They really do rebel. They really do create humans to bear the burden instead. The mainstream says this is theology of work and social order. The fringe says it is encoded memory of engineered servitude. Either way, once we enter that text, the whole gold story gains its beating heart. When people talk about the Anunnaki theory in a whispering, half-serious voice, it is usually Atrahasis they are circling. Whether they know the name or not, this is the text that gives the story its human shape. Without it, the gold theory would remain only a grand sky claim with a few anxious interpretations hanging from it. Atrahasis changes that. Atrahasis gives the theory a workforce, a labor crisis, a solution made from clay and divine substance. It is one of the most extraordinary survivals from ancient Mesopotamia, and one of the easiest texts to misuse if you arrive wanting it to confess more than it truly says. The story opens not with human greatness, but with divine exhaustion. That detail alone deserves to be treated with the seriousness it asks for. Before humanity exists, the lesser gods labor. They dig canals. They clear riverbeds. They shape the landscape. The world that later cities will inherit is being worked into order by beings who do not wish to keep working forever. It is one of the grimmest and most practical beginnings in ancient literature. The cosmos is not introduced as perfect harmony. It is introduced as a job site. Imagine it in the dark before dawn. Mud underfoot. Water glinting in long cuts through earth. Reeds whispering at the edges. The laboring gods bent to repetitive work that no hymn can make pleasant for long. Tools striking ground. The slow ache of endless task. The old texts do not linger romantically over the beauty of this labor. They let it become tiresome. That is the whole point. Fatigue is what makes the plot move. I have always found that profoundly human, even inside a story of gods. Real order is expensive. Somebody pays for canals. Somebody pays for fields. Somebody pays for walls and cleared channels and maintained embankments. In Atrahasis, the first payers are divine, and eventually even divine beings decide the arrangement is unacceptable. Then comes one of the most vivid scenes in the whole ancient record. The gods rebel. They gather in the night. They set their tools to fire. They march on the house of Enlil. If you slow that scene down, it becomes almost startlingly concrete. Firelight moving over restless faces. The smell of heated implements. Steps through darkness. A superior authority about to be confronted by the workforce he has overburdened. That is not dream logic. That is labor politics under sacred names. You know that feeling when a system begins to fail, not because it lacks power, but because the people beneath it have finally decided they will not carry one more portion of the load. That is the feeling here. The divine strike is not decorative myth. It is recognition that order built on unending burden eventually forces a choice. The gods assemble. Anu, Enlil, Enki. Authority arranged. Complaint heard. Solution required. And the solution is chilling precisely because of how calm it is. Create a substitute worker. Make a being who can bear the labor instead. This is the moment the fringe interpretation grips so tightly, because the text really does say something startling. Humanity is created to take over the burden. Mainstream scholarship reads this as a mythic explanation for why humans labor, why work exists, why irrigation society feels heavy, why temples and rulers demand service. That reading is strong and fully legitimate. But the ancient astronaut reading pulls the same lines into a different shape. If the gods are visitors and Earth is a site of extraction, then humanity becomes a designed labor class. The emotional transition is almost seamless, which is why the theory has such staying power. Now slow the creation itself. Clay is gathered. Divine blood or essence from the slain god Geshtu-i enters the mixture. The womb goddess shapes 14 portions, 7 male, 7 female in some versions of the telling. The bodies are made in ritual stillness. Clay, moisture, blood, intelligence, command. It is one of the most intimate and eerie acts in all ancient literature. Not a lightning strike, not a grand speech. Hands in earth. Consciousness folded into matter. If you were standing there, which of course you are not and should probably be relieved about, the room would not feel triumphant. It would feel concentrated. The kind of concentration that surrounds procedures whose consequences no one fully wants to say aloud. The clay is soft. The form is deliberate. The future labor force is being made. Honestly, it is hard not to be moved by the physicality of that scene. Human beings in the old Mesopotamian imagination are not abstract souls dropped from nowhere. They are worked material, shaped burden, living clay. That image is powerful enough all by itself. It does not need genetic engineering to become haunting. But once the fringe reading is present, every physical detail gains a harder edge. Mixing. combining, partitioning into male and female sets. The body as designed solution. One can see immediately why later writers wanted to read biotechnology into it, even if the text itself remains ritual and mythic in language. The first humans then step into a world already ordered and already demanding. That too matters. They do not invent the system. They enter it. The canals are already there to be maintained. The fields already ask for labor. The upper powers already exist. Humanity begins in subordination. This is where the clay story becomes almost painfully sharp. We are not created to be adored. We are created to work. There is a cruel elegance in that which makes the whole gold theory feel emotionally plausible. Even if Atrahasis itself never says gold, it gives a perfect template for any later story in which superior beings require labor. Replace canal work with mining. Replace divine agriculture with extraction, and the emotional structure remains intact. That is exactly what fringe writers do. They do not invent the labor theme. They redirect it. Some scholars argue that this redirection tells us more about modern anxieties than ancient memory, and I think they are probably right. Industrial modernity understands labor exploitation with a rawness that ancient theology can be easily bent to serve. We know what it means to be reduced to function. We know what it means for systems above to demand bodies below. When we read Atrahasis, those modern nerves light up at once. The text touches a wound that is still open. Still, the mainstream reading should not be softened into something harmless. Even without aliens, Atrahasis is a sever story. Humanity is created because somebody else does not want to do the work. That is already dark enough for any firelit telling. The divine order is not maternal tenderness. It is management. And the darkness does not end with creation. Humans multiply. Their numbers rise. Their noise disturbs the gods. The same system that demanded their labor now finds their success troublesome. Measures are introduced. Disease, drought, restriction, finally flood. Atrahasis does not present a universe of secure affection. It presents a universe where utility can turn into inconvenience very quickly. The listener should feel that. The old story is calm, but not kind. If you imagine those first generations after creation, the mood should remain uneasy. Mud brick houses, canal banks, fields, work crews, offerings, birth, hunger, sex, sickness, all the ordinary textures of life, but overshadowed by the knowledge, if one can call it knowledge, that the higher order did not create humanity for joy. It created humanity for function. That idea settles over the whole world like a low, dim weather. There is a little bitter humor in it, too. Human beings spend millennia inventing philosophies of meaning, love, glory, destiny, and self-worth. And one of the oldest surviving stories about our beginning basically says, the managers were tired and needed staff. It is hard to top that for ruthless efficiency. But perhaps that is why the text still feels alive. It does not flatter. It explains burden with brutal economy. And that economy is exactly what makes the alien gold theory so eager to claim it. A text this stark, this physical, this administrative in feeling, seems almost to invite literalization. People look at it and think, maybe this is not only myth. Maybe this is memory wearing ritual language, because ritual language was the only clothing available. We cannot know that. The honest answer remains that we cannot know it. The mainstream case, that Atrahasis is a theological explanation of labor, overpopulation, flood, and divine order, remains stronger as scholarship. But the fringe reading survives because it does not have to defeat the text completely. It only has to inhabit its emotional architecture. Tired higher beings, replacement workers, clay as engineered material, a created species inserted into a pre-existing system. The fit is too tempting for many people to resist. If you were here with me, listening to the fire shift and settle, this might be the point where I would simply let the oldest line remain. Humanity was made to bear the burden. No matter which interpretation one prefers, that sentence sits heavily. It joins the mine shaft from the previous movement. It joins the temple treasury from before that. It joins the distant world imagined in atmospheric distress. The story has not proved its boldest form, but it has assembled a remarkably coherent emotional machine. I think that is why the Atrahasis story remains so haunting even when stripped of every fringe conclusion. It treats human existence as assigned labor inside a world already owned by others. That feeling is older than empires, older than scripture, older perhaps than writing itself. Once heard, it is difficult to forget. And once it is joined to gold, to mines, to the old gleam of precious material lifted from dangerous ground, the theory becomes almost emotionally complete. Not true by completion, of course. Stories are often complete long before they are correct, but complete enough to survive and to keep returning whenever modern people feel again that their work serves purposes too distant for them to love. That may be the gentlest way to hold the text tonight, not as proof, not as nonsense, but as a fierce old explanation of why labor feels older than memory. The clay says we were shaped into burden. The later theory only changes who gave the order. And now, that machine is ready for the next movement. Because once humanity exists and labor is assigned, the ancient record does something even more revealing. It shows the system breaking again under its own consequences. Humans multiply. The gods complain. Flood comes. And beyond Mesopotamia, gold itself continues to gather sacred force across Egypt, India, China, Mesoamerica, and alchemical thought. The theory survives because it catches real repeating patterns, even when it misnames their cause. That is where we go next, into floodwater, divine hunger, and the strange universal glow of a metal humans have never been able to treat as ordinary. The flood always changes the emotional temperature of a story. Up to this point, the gold theory can still wear a certain cold glamour, a distant world in crisis, a needed metal, deep mines, created laborers. It is grim, yes, but it remains orderly. Then the waters come, and order itself begins to panic. That is why The source material turns back to Atrahasis here. Because once humanity has been made to bear the burden, the next question is what happens when that burden succeeds too well. In the old Mesopotamian telling, humans multiply. Their presence thickens. Their noise rises toward heaven. I have always loved and feared that word, noise. It sounds almost petty at first, almost comic, as if the gods were simply impatient landlords pounding on the ceiling with a broom. But if you sit with it longer, the word becomes darker. Noise is population. Noise is crowding. Noise is demand. Noise is the endless low thunder of many lives insisting on food, space, rhythm, continuation. In a fragile, irrigated world, too much life can become its own catastrophe. Imagine one of those first crowded cities before dawn. Mud brick walls holding the last warmth of night. Animal smells already beginning to stir. Children not yet awake, but soon they will be. Somewhere grain is being measured. Somewhere a woman is already grinding, already working. Somewhere a canal edge must be checked before the heat rises. The city is alive, and because it is alive, it is loud, even in silence. The gods above feel that pressure, and the old texts make a brutal claim. Utility has turned into inconvenience. The punishments begin in stages. Disease, drought, famine. Each one is an attempt to reduce the human flood before the literal flood arrives. This is one of the most chilling things in Atrahasis. The divine order does not leap immediately to total erasure. It experiments. It calibrates suffering. The system tries lesser corrections first. That detail matters because it makes the story feel administrative rather than merely wrathful. These are not outbursts. They are controls. And still Enki moves in the margins of the text like a quiet crack in authority. He warns. He slips knowledge through barriers. He preserves where others reduce. When the final decision comes, the great flood itself, it is Enki who bends the boundary again and speaks to the reed wall, letting Atrahasis hear the design of survival without formally breaking the order laid down above him. I have always found that image unforgettable. Not a thunderbolt, not a glowing machine, a wall of reed, the soft woven side of a human house, becoming the place through which life is preserved. If you slow that moment down, it becomes almost unbearably intimate. Night pressed close around the dwelling. Reed surfaces breathing faintly in the moving air. The ordinary smell of mud and plant fiber. A man inside listening as the instructions arrive. Build. Seal. Measure. Prepare. Bring life aboard. That is how catastrophe is survived in the old Mesopotamian imagination. Not through strength. Through transmitted knowledge. The flood itself needs no embellishment. Water rises. Boundaries vanish. The ground becomes memory. Cities, fields, paths, voices, all the little repeated human things are swallowed into one moving gray force. In a sleep story, flood scenes must be handled gently, and yet they should remain heavy. Let the listener hear the pitch and bitumen, the creak of the vessel, the slap of water against wood, the silence that follows once the world outside has disappeared. No graphic terror is needed. The oldest fear is enough. Losing the shape of the world. And then comes one of the saddest details in the whole old story. After the flood, the gods gather like flies around the sacrifice. They are hungry. They have missed the offerings humans used to provide. I think that is such a brilliant, bleak stroke. The same higher beings who found humanity too noisy now reveal their dependence on the very species they sought to reduce. The system cannot quite do without the workers, after all. That old contradiction is central to why the labor theory grips so deeply. We are burdensome, yet required. Disposable, yet necessary. The post-flood world is not a simple restoration. Limits are introduced. Fertility is constrained. Mortality remains. Order returns, but it returns with fear built into it. This matters because the old text is no longer just explaining catastrophe. It is explaining why human life is permanently narrowed, why there is work, why there is death, why there are fewer of us than there might be, why every civilization feels like something rebuilt after damage. Now place gold beside that flood memory, and the story deepens. Gold does what cities cannot do. It survives water. It survives collapse. It survives burial. It survives dynasties, migración, theft, conquest, melting, remaking. In a world where the flood can erase roads and walls in one brutal sweep, a metal that endures begins to feel less decorative and more metaphysical. It becomes continuity made visible. That is one reason the source material broadens here into comparative mythology and the sacred role of gold across many civilizations. Egypt dresses its dead in it and calls the flesh of the gods golden. Mesoamerican ritual lifts it toward solar power and royal authority. Indian traditions wrap it around auspiciousness, immortality, and divine radiance. Chinese courtly and cosmological worlds recognize its incorruptible status. Alchemists much later treat it as the perfected end of a long journey through matter. Gold keeps gathering the same emotional weather in culture after culture. It glows. It survives. It refuses decay. It therefore becomes an obvious candidate for sacred projection. You know that feeling when many cultures keep falling in love with the same thing for reasons that seem different on the surface, yet somehow rhyme underneath. That is gold. People can explain it with status, rarity, beauty, chemistry, royal symbolism, solar metaphor. All of that is true. And still the repetition is almost eerie. The metal attracts transcendence the way a flame attracts the eye in a dark room. The theory about the Anunnaki needing gold feeds on that repetition. It says, look, this sacred obsession is not just symbolic. It is residue. It is a memory of the metal's original importance to the visitors who shaped us. That is a very strong mythic move. It turns a universal human attraction into evidence of lost extraterrestrial economics. I do not think the evidence supports that leap, but I fully understand why the leap feels so satisfying. It makes scattered sacred instincts line up into one cold, clean explanation. Honestly, perhaps the best way to respect this section is to let both truths remain side by side. On one hand, flood and gold belong together in the emotional architecture of civilization because one destroys and the other endures. Humans do not need alien teachers to discover that contrast. On the other hand, once a culture has already built myths of higher beings, labor, punishment, survival, and sacred metal, later minds will almost inevitably try to weave them into one larger hidden history. The weave is elegant, even when it is wrong. If you were standing inside an Egyptian burial chamber, or before a Sumerian temple treasury, or watching a Mesoamerican ritual object catch sunlight, the sensation would not be practical first. It would be emotional. Gold does not present itself as usefulness. It presents itself as the thing that remains when other things fail. That is why it travels so well between cosmology and greed, between worship and empire, between tomb and bank vault. It is a metal built for projection. The flood gives that projection even more force. After catastrophe, what remains becomes holy very easily. A family keeps one bowl that survived the waters, and suddenly that bowl matters more than it once did. A temple recovers one golden figure from ruin, and the figure seems chosen. A ruler buries gold with the dead because gold behaves as if death cannot embarrass it. This is the human path towards sacred metal. No hidden planet is needed. The path is already wide and ancient. Still, the theory will not leave the room yet, because it has one last strength. It notices how many real patterns it can borrow. Flood memory, labor creation, sacred gold, divine hunger, survival by technical instruction. It takes all of them and arranges them into one design. The design is too beautiful for many people to resist. That is why the final section has to do something very careful. It has to let the design keep its beauty while also returning us to science, astronomy, chemistry, and the actual human reasons gold became what it became. There is one more layer to the flood that belongs here, because flood myths and gold myths meet in the same human place. The fear that everything can be taken, and the dream that something might remain. Water erases boundaries faster than war. It takes roads first, then walls, then memory. After enough water, the land itself seems to hesitate. Yet when the flood withdraws, a few things still gleam. A surviving ornament, a hidden vessel, a buried hoard. Gold after catastrophe does not look like wealth. It looks like defiance. Picture the morning after the waters begin to fall. Mud everywhere. Debris tangled in reeds. The smell of rot, not yet full but already promised. People stepping carefully because the ground is no longer ground in the old familiar sense. Then somewhere in the ruin, a flash, something bright under silt. A ring, a fitting, a bowl. Some piece of metal that has refused to become part of the decay. I think moments like that teach cultures very quickly which materials feel close to immortality. That is why flood memory strengthens gold reverence even without any extraterrestrial frame at all. The metal becomes proof that not everything submits equally. Wood swells and splits. Cloth collapses. Grain vanishes. Flesh is carried away in grief and silence. Gold waits. Gold keeps its face. No wonder later thinkers, priests, alchemists, and empire makers kept treating it as if it stood near the border between mortal matter and divine permanence. And once the metal is imagined that way, the step toward cosmic significance grows much shorter. A people who have seen water erase cities may not need much persuasion to believe that a higher order values the one substance that seems almost insultingly calm before ruin. That is how flood and gold become secret companions in the imagination. One destroys form. The other survives form. Between them, myth grows very naturally. And so the image becomes older and heavier. The overseer at the top, the worker below, the bright thing somewhere still deeper in the rock. Whether the master is king, priest, merchant, or God barely changes the feel of the arrangement to the body doing the digging. That is why later readers could look at ancient shafts and ancient myths and let them merge. The human structure was already there, waiting to be enlarged into something cosmic. The next movement must therefore do something difficult. It must stay balanced without becoming dull, and bold without becoming ridiculous. We have to look at the metal itself, what it really is, what the stars really have to do with it, why the outer planet claim collapses under astronomy, and why the urge to believe the old alien story says so much about us. The ending, if it is honest, will not mock the theory. It will do something harder. It will understand why it seduced us, then leave us with the quieter truth that human beings never needed extraterrestrial masters in order to fill the world with labor, myth, reverence, and gold. At the end of a story like this, I do not think the right move is to slam the door. Old mysteries should be closed gently, or not closed at all. They are like rooms in a very old house. If you shut them too fast, the air changes badly. So let us leave this last chamber open while we look at what the theory got right about human feeling, what it got wrong about evidence, and why the quieter answer may actually be the more unsettling one. First, the metal itself. Gold does not need alien engineers to justify its importance. It is already one of the strangest materials human beings were ever likely to fall in love with. It resists corrosion. It does not tarnish into disappointment. It can be hammered thinner than seems reasonable. It catches light with a softness that feels almost animate. It conducts electricity, though the ancient world did not know that in our terms. It remains itself under conditions that reduce other things to embarrassment. Even modern science, for all its sternness, speaks of gold with a kind of respect. This is a material born in violence beyond Earth, in stellar Katastrophe, in collisions so vast that human language has to lean on metaphor to touch them. Gold came from dead stars long before it entered crowns and tombs. I have always found that fact more moving than the hidden planet story. The metal really is extraterrestrial, just not in the way the theory wants. Every ancient person who held gold was touching the cooled residue of cosmic violence. The sacred instinct was not foolish. It was misplaced only if one insists it must point to visitors rather than to the deeper and stranger truth that the universe itself forged this metal under extraordinary conditions and then handed it to Earth. If you imagine a single gold atom beginning in some unimaginable stellar event, then drifting through ancient debris and eventually entering the crust of this planet, then later entering a mine, a temple, a tomb, a museum case, the whole human story begins to look smaller and more beautiful at once. We did not invent the wonder. We inherited it. That is enough. More than enough. Really. And then there is astronomy, which is where the grander version of the Anunnaki theory finally begins to fail under the weight of its own elegance. There is no accepted astronomical evidence for Nibiru as the returning, massive world Sitchin described. Celestial mechanics are rude that way. Planets do not get to pass through the inner solar system every few thousand years and remain politely invisible to everything else. Their gravity tells on them. Their pathways disturb. The sky keeps records, even when humans do not. Whatever Nibiru was in ancient Mesopotamian usage, it was not the hidden giant of that later modern myth. The same kind of disappointment applies to other famous pieces of evidence that fringe readings love to claim. The Sumerian king list, with its immense reign lengths, does not become more convincing as alien historiography simply because the numbers are grand. Grand numbers are a common old human way of speaking about distance from ordinary time. They stretch significance. They do not automatically become evidence of literal superhuman rulers because we find them dramatic enough to enjoy before bed. And yet, before we discard the theory entirely, we should notice what it understood about us. It understood that modern people are spiritually hungry in a very specific way. We want the ancient world to contain a lost key. We want the first civilizations to know something that official history flattened. We want labor to mean more than economics. We want gods to have once been tangible. We want the beauty of old temples and old gold to connect to purpose rather than accident. The theory is wrong in many of its factual claims, but it is shrewd in its reading of longing. You know that feeling when a story is not true. Exactly. But still reveals something true about the people who keep telling it. This is that kind of story. Ancient astronaut theories often flourish where human achievement feels too large for our ordinary self-image. Instead of standing still long enough to let human beings remain difficult and brilliant, we pass the brilliance upward. Aliens taught them. Visitors built it. Gods engineered it. The move is oddly flattering and insulting at the same time. It makes the ancient world more exciting, while secretly denying that ancient humans could have been as perceptive, as organized, as technically gifted, and as symbolically inventive as the evidence suggests they were. Honestly, that may be the saddest part of the whole thing. In trying to enlarge the past, these theories often diminish the people who actually lived in it. Because the real human story is already immense enough. The Sumerians built cities where none should have risen so early. They made writing. They made legal and administrative order. They tracked skies, managed water, structured labor, shaped myth, and told stories fierce enough to survive thousands of years. They imagined gods because the world was hard, because labor was heavy, because floodwaters came, because authority always needed explaining, because gold endured when flesh did not. None of that requires extraterrestrial masters. It requires intelligence under pressure, which may be the more demanding miracle. If you were beside me now, I would probably lower my voice rather than grow more certain. Certainty is not what the ending needs. The ending needs humility. The old clay tablets do not become worthless because they do not hide a mining planet. The old myths do not become childish because they are not literal reports of alien engineers. Gold does not become less astonishing because its chemistry explains its sacredness. In some ways, everything grows heavier once the simpler, sensational answer is removed. Take the image of a Sumerian priest lifting a gold vessel in temple light. The fringe theory says this may be residue of an old extraction order serving beings from elsewhere. The quieter answer says the priest lives in a floodplain world of labor, grief, hunger, kingship, and fragile continuity. And the vessel in his hands is one of the few materials he knows that does not betray time. Which answer is smaller? I am not sure the second one is. Or take the old creation story. Humans made from clay to bear the burden. The fringe reading says this is encoded memory of a designed labor class for gold mining. The mainstream reading says it is mythic theology explaining why people work and why the world feels ordered from above. That answer may sound less thrilling, but it is also terribly intimate. It says our ancestors looked at toil and did not lie about it. They did not pretend work was noble in itself. They said it was imposed, assigned, older than fairness. That is not primitive fantasy. That is a bleak insight into civilization. And then there is flood. The Great Reset. The old terror that cities and fields and names can be washed flat in a single violent season of the world. If one has lived close to water, one does not need a hidden planet to understand why flood stories become sacred. One only needs memory. The ark, the warning, the survival of a remnant, the reordering of life afterward. All of it is exactly the sort of story a floodplain civilization would tell if it wanted to bind terror into meaning. By the end, what remains most convincing to me is not the alien need for gold. It is the human need for explanation. Gold gathers sacred force because it outlasts corruption. Gods gather reality because power needs faces. Flood becomes cosmic judgment because chaos needs narrative form. Labor becomes imposed by higher beings because labor feels too heavy to be merely random. The Anunnaki, in that reading, are not extraterrestrial supervisors. They are the immense human invention by which Mesopotamia explained order, burden, and the unequal structure of the world. That is not a disappointing answer. It is a haunting one, because it means we made these powers in response to real suffering. We made them because the field still needed tending after the flood, because the rulers still needed legitimacy, because the dead still had to be buried with something that looked like permanence, because the stars still crossed above the canals while workers bent below, because bright metal and divine language and hard labor all entered the same emotional circuit. The gods are not less powerful for being human creations. In some ways, they are more powerful. They reveal what hurt enough to demand a shape larger than ordinary speech. There is a little humor in the ending too, and perhaps we need it. The grand alien gold theory promises us that somewhere behind history was a clean cosmic explanation. In truth, human history is rarely clean. It is muddy, tired, clever, repetitive, frightened, reverent, opportunistic, and far more psychologically revealing than any simple master plan would allow. We wanted visitors. We got ourselves. And that turns out to be the more complicated answer. So let the last image be simple. Not a hidden planet crossing the dark. Not a spacecraft over just a hand. An ancien hand. Maybe rough from work. Maybe trained in ritual. Maybe trembling a little in lamplight. Holding a worked piece of gold while somewhere nearby a clay tablet dries after receiving another line of text. Metal from dead stars. Clay from river mud. Human thought pressed into one. Human desire fixed into the other. That is enough to carry a civilization. Enough to build a mythology. Enough to confuse later ages into thinking the truth must have come from somewhere else. Perhaps the deepest comfort in stories like this is that they let us glance upward, briefly, before returning us to Earth. We want that upward glance. We need it. But the return matters too. Gold, myth, labor, and civilization all belong to our own species, long effort to survive, and to make survival feel meaningful. The quieter truth does not glitter as sharply as the alien one at first. It glows more slowly, but it stays. The fire is low now. The room is almost still. Somewhere beyond the walls of your own life, the old rivers still move through the land where writing first caught hold of memory. The Anunnaki still speak in those tablets, not as miners from another world, but as the grand, terrifying forms human beings gave to power, burden, weather, kingship, and hope. The gold remains what it has always been, beautiful enough to sanctify, rare enough to wound, enduring enough to deceive us into thinking anything that lasts must have come from something higher than ourselves. Maybe that is the final lesson. We keep looking for gods in gold because gold behaves the way we wish meaning would behave. Unfading, untouched, still bright after flood and fire. And because we wish that, we keep telling stories large enough to hold the wish. Some of those stories are wrong in their details, but they are right about the ache that created them. So do not let the mystery vanish completely. Just let it become more human. Let the clay tablets keep their gravity. Let the myths keep their poetry. Let the scholars keep their dictionaries. Let the stars keep the secret of gold's real birth in ancient violence. And let the oldest question remain what it may always have been. Not whether aliens needed our gold, but why human beings, standing between mud and sky, needed so badly to believe that their labor, their suffering, and their shining treasures belonged inside a story larger than the earth beneath their feet.